Hello, I'm Brian Vermeer, and today we'll be doing the third in our series on the Sermon on the Mount. If you remember last week, we mentioned that Jesus said he did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. Well, today we're going to start a series that I like to call It's Not the Action, It's the Intention. And we're going to see what Jesus means by the law. At that time, remember, there were a couple of groups, the scribes and the Pharisees, who strictly held to the letter of the law. As long as you did exactly what the law said, then they felt you were okay with God or you were right with God. Today, Jesus is going to begin a series where he takes a few of the laws and is going to explain what God really meant by them and how God judges us not on our actions, not what we actually do, but he actually judges us before we get to the action. He judges us on our intentions. So let's begin here in Matthew chapter 5, looking at verses 21 through 26. And we'll start here with verses 21 and 22. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to our ancestors, 'Do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Fool,' will be subject to the Sanhedrin. But whoever says, 'You moron,' will be subject to hellfire." So, Jesus is quoting the law there in verse 21. You've heard that it was said to our ancestors. He's referencing back when God first gave the law to Moses. One of the original 10 commandments was, "Thou shalt not kill," which many people have kind of misinterpreted. A better translation of the word kill there is actually murder. Thou shalt not murder, or you shall not commit murder. And so, in other words, the commandment was not just a blanket, don't kill people, or some even interpret it to mean don't kill animals. God in that commandment was specifically prohibiting premeditated murder. Don't plan to murder anybody. Don't, in your anger, kill anybody. He was not saying that warfare, killing someone in warfare was wrong. He was not saying killing somebody in self-defense even was wrong. In fact, he gave some conditions that a person who killed in self-defense could do to keep himself from being judged for it. So Jesus said, that's the commandment. You know the commandment says, don't commit murder. But let me tell you what God actually meant by that. He says in verse 22, "I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment." You see, murder isn't something that someone just does. Murder happens for a reason. If you murder someone, you've most likely got a reason that you're doing it, and in many cases, that reason is because you've got something against that person. You want that person killed for some reason. And many times, the reason is simply anger because you don't like that person or you're mad at that person about something. So, Jesus is saying, it's not the murder itself that is the sin. The real sin occurs when you become angry enough with your brother, with another person, that you want to kill him. When you get to the point where you have decided, I am going to kill that person, that's when you've committed the sin. And the rest is just follow through. So, having the anger itself that leads to murder is what Jesus is condemning here. Don't let yourself get so angry with someone that the thought of killing him even enters your mind. Jesus says, whoever says to his brother, "Fool," will be subject to the Sanhedrin. The word translated fool there is the Greek word racha, which we're not really sure exactly what it means, but in the context, fool or idiot or something like that is very likely what he meant. But then he says, but whoever says, "You moron," will be subject to hellfire. The word moron there comes from the Greek word moros, which is where we get that word moron. And it means an idiot or someone who is mentally deficient. Interesting story here. When I taught 10th graders, they would come into class and they were so proud because they were now sophomores instead of freshmen. And I would ask them if they knew what the word sophomore meant. Because, freshmen, of course, they knew meant freshman, that is, the new people on campus. Senior, of course, meant the ones that were the highest up. Juniors were just below seniors. So I asked them what the word sophomore meant. None of them knew. So I tell them it comes from two Greek words, the words sophos and moros. Sophos means wisdom, and moros means a moron, an idiot. So a sophomore is a person who has already completed 1 year of school, therefore he thinks he is smart. But the truth is, he's an idiot. He hasn't learned nearly enough yet. As we might say, just enough learning to make you dangerous. Well, here, Jesus is saying, this word, raka, translated fool, a person in that sense is a person who is not necessarily behaving stupidly or idiotically. This is a person who is behaving in a sinful type lifestyle. And he says, no, anyone who calls his brother that, and he's referring to calling him that in anger. When you get mad enough that you start insulting somebody, that's when you've committed a sin. And according to Jesus, that's what could get you in trouble. That's what could get you in trouble with the law, because the Pharisees said if you called somebody that, then you were in trouble with the law. Because that was the way they interpreted the commands that God gave. But Jesus says that he tells us anyone who is mad enough to call someone a moron is in danger of going to hell, because that's what the sin actually is. You don't commit murder when you kill someone. You commit murder when you allow your anger or when you allow feelings inside you to get bad enough that you're putting that other person down. I've always said that when you're arguing with somebody, as soon as one person begins calling names, that person has just lost the argument, because they've run out of good things to say. They've run out of good arguments to bring up. So Jesus is saying here that the sin actually occurs before the action of murder. It occurs when you get the intention. It occurs when you become so angry with someone else that you want them hurt or you want them killed. None of us should ever wish death on anybody. Death is a final thing. The only time that I can imagine myself asking God to kill someone or to allow someone to die would be if that person was in such a bad medical condition that it was fairly certain that the person was going to die anyway, and I would want the person relieved from the pain they were in. And that's the only way I can imagine myself praying for somebody to be killed or somebody to die. Death is not something we should wish on anyone. So the sin occurs when we get to that point, when we get to the point where we wish that something bad would happen to another person. We certainly should not do that. So, verse 23 and 24, he says, so if you're offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go out and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. So if you're a Christian, and remember, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is speaking to Christians, and you are in church worshiping, and you remember that someone has been offended by you, that somebody is holding a grudge against you, and certainly if you're holding a grudge against somebody else, Jesus says it's best if you just leave your gift there, and before you come back to the worship, before you come back to give your gift, go and make up with whoever it is has the offense or whoever it is that you are offended by. You should not hold a grudge against any person, and as best as you are able, you should not allow anyone to hold a grudge against you. First of all, you should live your life in such a way that people can't hold a grudge against you. You should be living your life in such a way that people look at you and say, there's a great person, that's somebody I'd want to be like. But times are going to come, if you're like anyone, there's going to be people that will find things wrong with you. There's going to be people who are going to be offended by things you do or say. And sometimes it's because we're living our lives the way we should be. Certainly, non Christians many times are offended by people who live the Christian lifestyle. But we certainly don't want people to hold a grudge against us. Now, that doesn't mean we necessarily give in to all their demands. But Jesus says, as best as we can, we should make sure that we don't hold a grudge against anybody else and try our best to make up with anyone who holds a grudge against us. If someone has done something to you and you know that you're feeling that enmity toward him, you should do your best. You should find it in your heart as best you can to forgive that person. And that's what Jesus is asking here. And if you know that you've offended somebody, you should go to that person and use a sentence that I learned when I worked in the restaurant business, which is simply, what can I do to make it right? That's what they asked us when a customer would come in and complain about the service they received or about the food they received. We were to ask, what can I do to make it right? And that's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever received. If you know that you've done something that someone else doesn't like, and you know they're holding a grudge against you because of that, just simply ask them that question. And then as best as you can, do what you can do to make it right. As long as you're not breaking the will of God in the process, you should try to make it right with everyone. Don't let anger fester in your heart. Don't keep your feelings bottled in. If you have a grudge against someone else, go and find out what the problem is if you don't know. And if you do know what the problem is, do the best you can to correct it. Then you'll be in a right spirit to worship. Let's finish here now by looking at verses 25 and 26. This has to do more with a legal situation. He says in verse 25, reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge to the officer, and you'll be thrown into prison. I assure you, you will never get out of there until you've paid the last penny. Christians should not file lawsuits against other Christians. Christians should do the best they can to avoid legal complications with other Christians. And Jesus is going to address this more later on. But here he simply says, reach a settlement quickly. Whatever it takes. If someone is filing a lawsuit against you, do what it takes to make up with that person before you go to court. Because I don't care if you're in the wrong or you're in the right, it's still going to look bad on you. Whether you are found guilty or not guilty, it's still going to reflect on your reputation, especially on your reputation as a Christian. No matter what the judge's decision is, there are still going to be many people who believe that you are in the wrong. So in these cases, especially if you know you are in the wrong, Jesus says, reach a settlement quickly. Find out again. Ask the person, what can I do to make it right? Instead of you filing a suit against me, what do you want? What can I do to settle it? The reason he says this, while you're on your way with him, at that time, the legal system required people who were involved in a lawsuit to walk to the court together. And they could discuss it back and forth while they were on the way. And hopefully then they would settle it, and then the judge wouldn't have to worry about it. Our legal system is backed up enough as it is. We don't need to make it even more so by bringing up petty lawsuits because someone did something that we didn't like. If that person is a Christian and we're a Christian, then we're supposed to do our best to have good relations with them. We certainly should not be allowing differences to cause legal problems. Certainly a Christian can settle things with another Christian. And that's what Jesus is asking here. Even though lawsuits were permitted by the law, Jesus says, the intent of the law is for it not to get to that point. If somebody has something against you, make it right. If you have something against somebody, make it right. Don't let it get to the point where you are wanting to go to court, or even worse, to actually inflict bodily harm or even death on that other person. Don't let it get to the point to where that person wants to do it to you. Hopefully, you will never do anything that will make somebody want to kill you. But if you do, then for your own sake, please find a way to make it right, to settle it. That's what Jesus means when he says, "Thou shalt not murder." Don't let it even enter your head that you have enough of a problem with someone that you'd want to murder him or even take him to court. Instead, do your best as you can to live in peace with everyone else, as long as you're not breaking God's will in the process. Now, there may be times that the only way to do it would be for you to do something which you know is against God's will. And if that's the case, then certainly the will of God comes before the will of men. But don't let yourself get so angry, and don't let that anger fester, because then other sinful thoughts may enter your head. And it's not the action of committing murder or filing the lawsuit. It's the intention. You've committed the sin when you've already made up your mind that you're going to do something that harms somebody else. That's not what Jesus intended. That's not what God intended when he gave the law. So Jesus is explaining the law and what the law actually meant. Next week, we're going to be looking at more familial situations. What did God really mean when he said, "Don't commit adultery"? So I'll see you again next week.